A war that stretched across continents began with a simple contradiction for thousands of would-be volunteers in Palestine. They were ready to fight, yet told they could not do so under their own name. When Britain declared war on 3 September 1939, the Yeshuv's political leaders responded almost immediately, showing their intention to stand with the Allies. But the reply that travelled back through cables and diplomatic channels carried a different tone. The British Empire needed manpower, yet hesitated to approve anything that looked like a national Jewish force. The war had begun, but for many, the doorway into it felt only partly open. Across the settlements of the Mandate Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa, young men and women came forward for service. Some had trained in local defense groups. Others arrived with family histories shaped by earlier wars or recent escape from Europe. In their minds, the stakes were already clear. Nazi Germany had shown what it wanted. Fighting was not only an act of loyalty to Britain, but also an act of survival for Jews more broadly. Yet, in London, strategic concerns overshadowed the moral clarity felt on the ground. The War Office's early reports reveal that hesitation. Senior officials feared that creating a Jewish combat unit might inflame Arab opinion, at a moment when the Middle East was balanced between Allied interests and Axis influence. Italy's presence in Libya, Germany's propaganda broadcasts in Arabic, and the fragility of regional alliances made British planners careful about any step that could shift political loyalties. As one internal summary in late 1939 put it, Jewish enthusiasm for enlistment was welcome. Jewish symbols in uniform were not. For volunteers, this difference landed with the weight of disappointment. They could serve, but only as individuals, never as a group carrying a national identity. Some accepted this realistically. Others saw it as another reminder of their uncertain place within a mandate that ruled them without giving them full political recognition. Even within the Yishuv, debates appeared. Not all leaders agreed on the exact form a Jewish unit should take, or how hard to push Britain at a moment when cooperation still seemed necessary. But on one point, sympathy was wide. If Jews were willing to face danger for Britain, they should be allowed to do so in a way that recognized who they were. It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty that David Ben-Gurion increased his lobbying. Through letters, meetings, and speeches delivered at a delicate political moment, he argued that a Jewish fighting force would not only strengthen the Allied cause, but also show Jewish determination and responsibility. His case drew from history as much as strategy. A people long denied the means of collective defense should be trusted to stand openly against fascism. Yet, British officials, aware of unrest during the Arab Revolt only a few years earlier, remained cautious. Each argument for recognition produced a counter-argument about stability. By early 1940, a compromise had appeared, not a brigade, not even a regiment, but small auxiliary companies within the British Army's Pioneer Corps. These units, formed under general British command, would accept Jewish volunteers for labour, construction, and logistical work. It was a modest step, one that fell far short of the Yishuv's hopes. But for many volunteers, it was still a doorway into the war. Their enlistment introduced new realities. Military life began with screenings, medical checks, and training built around British drill and discipline. Volunteers were given uniforms indistinguishable from those of anyone else. Their insignia carried no separate identity, no emblem of a people fighting together. Yet the sense of purpose remained strong. Even if they were not yet soldiers in the way they imagined, they were part of the Allied war effort, and as Europe darkened, that mattered. Soon after, movement orders arrived. The first small groups boarded ships at Haifa, bound for Egypt. Their departure marked something historic, if quiet. The first organized transfer of Jewish volunteers from Palestine into the North African theater. The trip across the Mediterranean was short, but symbolically heavy. They had left home not as a brigade, but as labor companies. Still, they were stepping into a region where the war was already shifting quickly. Awaiting them was a landscape defined by heat, dust, and an immensity of distance that shaped everything the British Army attempted. In 1940, Egypt was a center of Allied logistics, from Alexandria's docks to the depots along the Suez Canal. Here, the volunteers would soon discover that the work given to them, road repair, construction, manual labor, was physically demanding and far from glamorous, but it was not minor. In a desert war where supply lines meant survival, every meter of road and every reinforced position mattered. Yet even before the volunteers reached their new stations, one truth had begun to settle in. They had come to fight, but would not be allowed to fight as they wished. Their role, at least for now, was to build rather than battle. That reality would shape not only their experience of the war, but also the political struggle that followed. And as their transport convoys rolled deeper into Egypt, another shadow approached from the west, an armored force whose arrival would soon turn rear areas into contested ground and support companies into essential lifelines. The volunteers had reached the war, but the war was also moving toward them faster than anyone in London had expected. In North Africa, the Jewish volunteers finally reached the war, only to discover that the tools placed in their hands were not rifles, but shovels, picks, and heavy coils of wire. When their transports docked at Alexandria and Suez in 1940, the desert did not look like a battlefield at first glance. Ships creaked beside long stone quays, markets buzzed beyond the port gates, and British lorries rattled through narrow streets, already strained by the demands of a growing army. Yet beneath that surface lay a region preparing for a conflict that would stretch every supply line to its limits. And into that landscape stepped the men of the Pioneer Corps, expected to build the war effort from the ground up. Orientation began almost immediately. Volunteers were brought into large depots along the Canal Zone, where crates towered as walls and railway sidings ran endlessly into the desert. Here, they learned the reality of their assignment. They were part of the machinery that kept an army alive. Roads had to be laid, defences dug, ammunition unloaded, and supply dumps expanded before any British division could move toward the western desert. It was exhausting work, often carried out under the weight of the sun or through nights lit only by lamps and the rumble of distant artillery tests. Their tasks were shaped by the special demands of desert warfare. Sand swallowed tools, heat-bent metal, and any road not constantly maintained threatened to vanish beneath drifting dunes. The volunteers helped install wire obstacles, strengthen airfields, and prepare positions that stretched toward the Libyan frontier. And though their role was officially non-combatant, danger was never far away. Italian aircraft sometimes probed over Egypt, and the first air raid many volunteers experienced came not in battle but while repairing a rail spur near Alexandria. It was a reminder that the desert left few places truly safe. The companies themselves were a patchwork of the British Empire. Jewish volunteers from Palestine worked alongside Cypriots, Maltese, and British reservists, each group bringing its own language and customs. In mess tents and on work details, these differences created both tension and camaraderie. Commands were issued in English, but conversations drifted through several tongues, and friendships formed by necessity. Many volunteers had never travelled beyond the mandate before. Now they found themselves part of a wider army, moving through unfamiliar cultures while adapting to a military routine that demanded endurance above all. As 1940 turned into 1941, the war in North Africa accelerated. Italy's invasion of Egypt forced the British to stretch every available resource, and pioneer units were pushed into an operational tempo few had expected. During Operation Compass, the early British counter-offensive, roads had to be repaired quickly to keep armoured columns supplied. Volunteer companies followed behind the advancing divisions, clearing obstacles, extending supply points, and restoring captured buildings and routes. Their work let tanks and transports push deeper into Cyrenaica, but they remained far from the front, always just behind the fighting yet affected by its demands. Some tasks blurred the lines between rear and front. Long-haul convoys carrying water and ammunition exposed drivers and labourers to ambush or air attack. A single bombing run could scatter men across the sand, forcing them to dive for cover among crates meant for soldiers who never knew who had loaded them. Jewish volunteers wrote home about these moments with a mixture of pride and uncertainty. They were contributing directly to the campaign, yet were still kept out of the combat roles many had imagined when they enlisted. The British command, for its part, saw the value of these units. Reports from Middle East headquarters noted the reliability and stamina of the Jewish companies, especially in engineering tasks that required precision under challenging conditions. But such recognition did not change their official status. They were labor troops, essential yet almost unseen, carrying out key tasks without the honors or distinctions given to combat formations. This gap between contribution and recognition deepened a sense of unfinished identity. They served the Allied cause wholeheartedly, but still not as a national force. Even so, the desert shaped them. The harshness of the environment built discipline and unity, especially among those who would later become non-commissioned officers in more formal units. In the evenings, when work ended and the heat finally began to fall, men gathered in canvas tents, discussing news from home or rumors about the wider war. Some wondered whether their service would change British policy. Others felt resigned to the idea that they would remain laborers no matter how close they came to danger. Yet none could ignore a growing reality. Their work mattered, and the British Army depended on it more with each passing week. That dependence would soon deepen. By early 1941, the Desert War had entered an unstable phase. Italy's setbacks drew in a new enemy whose speed and skill would turn the supply lines the volunteers maintained into dangerous corridors. What had begun as rear area labor was about to take on a sharper edge, as the arrival of the Africa Corps pushed the fighting closer to every depot, road, and rail spur. The Jewish volunteers had come to North Africa expecting to serve behind the lines. Now, as armored divisions moved west and east in rapid succession, the meaning of behind the lines was about to change, and with it, the burden placed upon those who kept the army moving. The Jewish volunteers came to North Africa, believing they would support the war from a distance. But in the spring of 1941, distance began to shrink. The arrival of the Africa Corps under General Erwin Rommel turned the Western Desert from a theater of cautious maneuvers into one of the fastest-moving campaigns of the war. Supply lines that had once seemed comfortably behind the front were suddenly threatened, and the men of the Pioneer Corps found themselves working in a landscape where the rear could become the front line overnight. Rommel's first offensive swept eastward with a speed that unsettled even experienced British officers. As armoured columns pushed towards Cyrenaica and beyond, every road, depot, and workshop behind British positions came under pressure. For the Jewish volunteers, this meant that their responsibilities multiplied even as the margin for safety shrank. Engineering parties were sent to repair roads broken by tank tracks or bomb damage. Transport units were ordered to keep key routes open despite the risk of air attack. The pace of the campaign forced a near-constant state of urgency. Much of their work took place along the arteries that fed the fighting formations, long convoys of lorries carrying ammunition, water, rations, and spare parts. These were the lifelines of the 8th Army, and keeping them moving became a task as important as any undertaken at the front. Jewish drivers and laborers found themselves navigating roads where dust clouds gave away their position to enemy scouts, and where even a single strafing aircraft could scatter entire columns. Archives describe convoys reaching their destinations, reduced but intact, a phrase that captured both the danger and the determination needed to complete each journey. Engineering detachments faced a different kind of pressure. Retreats toward Gazala and then to the El Alamein line meant dismantling what could not be saved and strengthening what had to hold. Volunteers dug trenches, built earth walls and shelters, laid wire, and set up supply points at speed. They worked in conditions made harsher by shortages of tools and vehicles as the fighting units used up every available resource. Yet the desert demanded that these works be maintained constantly. A road left unattended for even a day could drift beneath sand. A water point left unsecured could fail when most needed. Their labor allowed infantry and armor to withdraw in order rather than chaos. In the skies above Egypt, especially around Alexandria and Cairo, anti-aircraft detachments with Jewish personnel took on a growing role. These were not frontline guns positioned among the forward divisions, but part of the layered defenses, protecting vital ports and bases. Their duty was to track and fire upon enemy bombers before they could disrupt shipping or damage the huge depots that fed the war. For many volunteers, this was the closest they came to a combat role, standing behind a gun they had trained to operate, listening for the drone of engines that signaled an incoming raid. It was dangerous work, but also work that brought them closer to the identity they had sought when they enlisted. The strain of these months weighed heavily on morale. Many had joined with the hope of forming a true fighting unit, something recognized not just for its manpower, but for its group identity. Now they faced the puzzle of proving themselves essential while still being denied the status they believed they had earned. Letters from the period describe a quiet frustration, pride in the tasks completed, but disappointment that their service remained limited to roles chosen for them rather than by them. They were helping to hold the line against one of the war's most powerful opponents, yet were still classified as auxiliary labor. Still, the desert taught resilience. The volunteers learned to read the terrain instinctively, to pace themselves through heat that punished the unprepared, and to work together with an efficiency born of need. Some emerged as natural leaders, forming the core of non-commissioned officers, who would later become the backbone of more formal Jewish formations. Their growing skill did not go unnoticed. Middle East Command reports noted their steadiness under fire and clear talent for engineering tasks, judgments that would later be used in arguments for a dedicated Jewish combat brigade. But as Rommel's forces pressed deeper, recognition remained uncertain. The volunteers continued to build, repair, and endure, even as rumors spread of a decisive battle approaching at a railway halt called El Alamein. For those who had watched the desert change around them, the name meant little at first. What mattered was the knowledge that another retreat might push them all the way to the Nile, and if the line held, it would be in part because the supply system they supported held with it. By mid-1942, the stage was set. The volunteers had served through advances and withdrawals, under bombing and dust storms, long enough to understand that their contribution went far beyond the labels given to them. Yet the question lingered, would this effort finally convince the British to recognize them as more than laborers? The answer, for the moment, lay in the desert west of Alexandria, where the British Army prepared for the battle that would decide the future of the North African campaign, and with it, the political future of those who had labored so long in its shadows. By the summer of 1942, the North African campaign had narrowed to a strip of desert between the Mediterranean and the Qattara Depression, a place British planners believed they could hold, and Rommel believed he could break. El Alamein was not remarkable for its landscape, it was remarkable for what it stopped. If the Axis broke through the line, Egypt and the Suez Canal could fall within weeks. As the Eighth Army prepared for a desperate stand, the Jewish volunteers, who had worked through retreat and uncertainty, now found themselves at the edge of the campaign's decisive moment, tasked with supporting a battle that would shape the future of the entire theatre. Their work began long before the first shells fell. Engineering parties were assigned to dig defensive trenches, strengthen positions, and help lay the complex layers of wire and mines that formed the backbone of the British defence. The volunteers had cut and built defences before, but never on such a scale or urgency. Every trench deepened before dawn, every post hammered into the ground, became part of a system designed to buy the Eighth Army time. They laboured beside British, Indian, South African, and Australian units, sharing tasks that blurred differences between nationality and role. The scale of preparation impressed even experienced officers. The volunteers were not soldiers in name, but their work contributed directly to the survival of the line. When the fighting grew more intense in July, their responsibilities shifted. Casualties mounted across the front, and pioneer companies were ordered to support medical teams, carrying stretchers over ground shaken by artillery, taking the wounded to aid posts, and clearing debris from bombed routes. These tasks were not glamorous, and offered no chance of battlefield honor, yet they demanded courage of a different kind, the courage to move toward danger not with a weapon, but with the knowledge that the next shell could fall at random. Reports from the period describe volunteers walking through smoke-filled gaps in the wire to bring out men who could no longer walk on their own. Air raids added another layer of strain. The approaches to Alexandria and Cairo were hit repeatedly, and anti-aircraft detachments with Jewish personnel found themselves firing through nights, lit by searchlights and tracer lines. Their guns were positioned not on the forward ridge, but around bases, ports, and depots that kept the army alive. When enemy bombers tried to disrupt supply dumps or strike at the city, these detachments were part of the shield that kept the logistical heart of the campaign beating. They were close enough to feel the shock of explosions, close enough to see the flashes reflected on the sea, yet still officially classed as support troops. For many volunteers, this contradiction, real danger but limited recognition, became sharper during El Alamein. Letters home carried pride in the work completed and frustration at the status held back. They had proven themselves through months of hardship, retreat, and rebuilding, yet remained unnamed in the military structure. Some wondered if the British simply did not see them. Others believed the political hesitation in London outweighed anything they accomplished in the desert. But quiet as their voices were, their actions registered where it mattered most, in the reports of officers who depended on them. Several such reports reached Cairo and then London. They spoke of units that worked without complaint, completed demanding engineering tasks, and showed steadiness under fire. One assessment noted that Jewish companies show determination equal to any regular battalion in its duties, a phrase that carried unexpected weight. For supporters of a Jewish combat brigade, these words were not just praise, they were proof. They showed ability, reliability, and moral commitment at a moment when the British Army needed all three. The volunteers had not set out to prove anything beyond their willingness to serve, yet the battle turned their labor into political capital. The second phase of the battle in October deepened this impression, as the Eighth Army launched its offensive, and the front shook under the weight of artillery and armor. Supply routes needed constant attention. Roads that cracked under tank treads had to be patched at once. Minefields had to be marked for advancing units. Wreckage had to be cleared before nightfall. Volunteers moved through this chaos with the same discipline they had shown since the campaign began. They were not on the front ridge, but they were in its shadow, supporting a battle that could not be won without them. And when the tide finally turned, when Rommel's forces began to pull back and the British sensed the momentum shifting, it brought more than relief. It brought a question that had hung in the air for years. If Jewish volunteers had proven themselves under the hardest conditions, would their service now lead to the creation of a recognized Jewish unit? Rumors passed in mess tents and on convoy routes. Some said London was reconsidering. Others warned that politics moved more slowly than battles. Yet the sense of possibility grew. The volunteers had survived the hardest months of the campaign, helped in its decisive battle, and earned respect far beyond what their original orders had suggested. But even as hope rose, uncertainty remained. The battle had shown their worth, but decisions made in Cairo and London did not always follow battlefield logic. Recognition still depended on politics, not just performance. As the Axis retreated westward across Libya, the volunteers followed in their usual role, repairing, rebuilding, and moving supplies. El Alamein had changed the direction of the war. Whether it would change their own future was a question that still hung in the hot desert air, unanswered for now, but impossible to ignore. The victory at El Alamein reshaped the war in North Africa, but for the Jewish volunteers who had worked behind the lines, it reshaped something more personal, their sense of what might now be possible. They had endured retreat, air raids, and exhaustion. They had helped support a decisive battle, and their performance had been noted in reports and messages. If ever there was a moment to argue for a recognized Jewish fighting unit, it had arrived. Yet the path to recognition would prove slower, more political, and more uncertain than any battlefield advance. The first signs of change appeared in Cairo, where officers who had worked closely with the pioneer units began sending favorable assessments to higher commands. These documents described the volunteers as disciplined, tough, and capable under pressure, words that might have carried limited weight during the chaotic months of retreat, but now, in the light of victory, seemed to point to a larger possibility. Supporters of a Jewish combat force seized on these reports, seeing them as a chance to raise the issue once more with the War Office. In Jerusalem, the Jewish Agency followed these developments closely. David Ben-Gurion, who had lobbied since 1939 for a distinct Jewish unit, increased his efforts in late 1942 and early 1943. He framed the argument not only in military terms, but also in moral and political ones. Jewish volunteers had proven their loyalty and endurance. They had helped turn the tide of the war. They deserved recognition in proportion to their service. His words reached sympathetic ears in some parts of the British administration, yet faced resistance in others. The question of how such a unit might affect relations with Arab leaders remained a constant constant source of hesitation. In London, Winston Churchill was more open. He had shown sympathy for the idea of a Jewish fighting formation earlier in the war, but the demands of overall strategy and the caution of the War Office had limited what could be done. Now, with the North African campaign stabilizing and Allied manpower stretched across multiple fronts, senior planners looked again at the matter. Britain needed trained, reliable soldiers, and in the files of Middle East headquarters, the Jewish companies had earned a reputation that made the discussion more serious than ever before. But political support did not turn into immediate action. The War Office worried about setting an example. If they approved a Jewish brigade, what messages might it send across the region? Would it be seen as a step toward political recognition beyond military need? And could they risk angering leaders whose cooperation Britain still depended on? Internal debates continued through the winter of 1942 and into 1943, producing careful interest but few firm decisions. For the volunteers, who heard rumors but saw no changes in their daily work, the delay was disheartening. Meanwhile, their work went on as the campaign pushed west into Libya. The same volunteers who had hoped for recognition found themselves once again maintaining roads, repairing captured facilities, and supporting long convoys, moving through areas marked by months of fighting. They watched as regular divisions advanced with growing confidence, while their own status stayed the same. Each successful operation underlined the tension between expectation and reality. They had served faithfully, yet still lacked the name, structure, and identity of a recognized unit. To address this, British commanders began taking smaller steps. Selected volunteers were offered higher-level courses, including non-commissioned officer training. Others were placed into more specialized roles within transport and engineering detachments, giving them a measure of independence and responsibility. These changes did not create a brigade, but they marked the rise of a more organized corpsmen gaining experience that would later prove vital when the time finally came for a formal Jewish formation. Still, progress was gradual. Political discussions remained slow, and volunteers wrote home with a mixture of pride and confusion. They felt valued as individuals, yet overlooked as a group. Some wondered whether their efforts during El Alamein had already faded from memory. Others believed the British were simply waiting for the right strategic moment. But none could deny that momentum, however faint, was building. By mid-1943, after months of debate, the War Office signaled what it had avoided, stating for years. In principle, it now accepted the idea of a Jewish combat brigade. The announcement was cautious, conditional, and lacking in immediate detail, but it was the first official step toward what volunteers had sought since the start of the war. The men who had supported the North African campaign, who had repaired roads under falling bombs, carried stretchers in the dust, and stood at anti-aircraft batteries during night raids, could finally imagine a future in which they might fight under a Jewish flag. That future, however, had not yet arrived. The brigade remained a promise, not a reality. Training, planning, and political coordination would take time. And even with official approval in principle, turning scattered pioneer units into a unified combat force was far from simple. As the North African campaign neared its end, the Jewish volunteers were left with a lasting sense of achievement mixed with uncertainty. The war had moved on. Tunisia lay ahead, and with it, the collapse of Axis power in Africa. Yet the question they carried remained unresolved. Would the recognition they had earned through labor, resilience, and sacrifice finally become real? The answer was drawing closer, but in a form, and at a moment, no one in the desert could yet predict. Victory in North Africa would open the door to new possibilities and new responsibilities, but the brigade they longed for was still months away from taking shape. When the Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered in May 1943, the war in North Africa ended with clarity that the previous years had rarely offered. For the British Army, the long struggle across desert and coast had finally closed. For the Jewish volunteers who had worked through those years, the end of the campaign brought not rest, but a change in purpose. The duties that had once demanded every hour of their strength began to ease, And in that space emerged the question that had followed them from the beginning. What would their service mean now that the desert battles were over? The surrender changed the demands placed upon the pioneer units. With frontline operations winding down across Libya and Tunisia, the broad infrastructure of the campaign no longer required the same level of upkeep. Supply dumps shrank, long-haul convoys lost urgency, and engineering tasks that once had to be finished overnight now passed to smaller teams. Many Jewish volunteers were moved to bases where training, not emergency repair, shaped their days. It was a sudden change from the relentless pressure they had lived under during the fight for Egypt and the long advance westward. These new assignments brought unexpected chances. Freed from the constant strain of moving with shifting front lines, volunteers could finally pull together the skills they had gathered piece by piece in the desert. Some attended leadership courses. Others trained in weapons or specialized engineering fields that had previously been closed to them. In these camps, the outline of a future fighting force began to appear, not officially, not yet, but in the slow development of men who had learned to endure the hardest tests the war could offer. At the same time, their service became a political tool. Supporters of a Jewish brigade, both in Palestine and inside the British administration, pointed to North Africa as proof of their reliability. The reports praising their work at El Alamein, their steadiness during retreats, and their role in the advance across Cyrenaica now circulated with fresh strength. The argument was simple. These volunteers had earned the right to fight as a recognized unit. Their loyalty had been tested. Their endurance had been proven. If Britain wanted motivated, experienced manpower, it already existed, waiting only for a name and a flag. Yet recognition still meant crossing a political landscape shaped by imperial interests. Some British officials remained cautious, seeing a Jewish combat brigade as a step with serious diplomatic effects. Britain still depended on cooperation from Arab leaders. It still feared that symbolic moves could shift regional loyalties at a key moment in the war. But others viewed the issue differently. By 1943, the size of the global conflict had stretched Allied manpower to its limits. A dedicated brigade of trained, committed volunteers was no longer simply a subject for political debate. It was an asset Britain could not easily ignore. Meanwhile, within the volunteer ranks, expectation grew slowly but clearly. The men who had once whispered about recognition now spoke of it with steadier confidence. The desert had been a harsh training ground. It had shaped their discipline, hardened their resilience, and given them an experience few auxiliary units could match. They had served in an environment defined by extremes, heat, distance, dust, and danger, and emerged not just as laborers but as soldiers in everything except official title. Administrative groundwork reflected this change. Officers began compiling detailed personnel lists, identifying experienced NCOs, and assessing which men could be moved into infantry or specialized combat roles if the War Office went ahead with its plans. Training schedules quietly expanded. Lessons shifted from simple maintenance tasks to wider military subjects. Without saying it openly, certain camps in Egypt and Palestine began acting as preparation centers for a formation that had not yet been announced. Despite these developments, uncertainty remained. The war's needs kept changing, and political decisions, even once agreed on in principle, required coordination across many offices. Volunteers lived in the gap between hope and delay, doing their duties while wondering whether the promise passed along their ranks would come true. Many had seen enough bureaucracy to know that victories on paper did not always lead to action on the ground. As 1943 went on, however, signs of movement became harder to ignore. Senior commanders spoke more openly of a Jewish combat unit. Training officers began shaping their teaching with new seriousness, and political leaders in Jerusalem mentioned the idea in speeches once given more carefully. The momentum that had begun with reports from the desert now built up in meeting rooms and headquarters across Cairo and London. It was not yet a brigade, but it was no longer just a hope. For the volunteers, The end of North Africa was therefore neither an ending nor a pause. The campaign had defined them, even if it had not allowed them to fight under the identity they asked for. It had shown their endurance, their discipline, and their commitment, and it had given shape to the argument that would finally win, that a Jewish brigade was not an experiment, but a recognition of years already served. As they trained, waited, and prepared for orders that seemed always just beyond reach, they could not know one final irony. The brigade they had fought so long to create would appear only after the Desert War had faded behind them, meant for a new theatre far from the sands that had shaped their struggle. When official orders finally arrived from London on 20 September 1944, they carried a weight far exceeding the paper they were printed on. After years of lobbying, service, and uncertainty, the British War Office approved the creation of the Jewish Brigade Group, a formal, named combat-ready formation within the British Army. It was a decision shaped not by a single moment, but by the combined story of those who had worked in the shadows of the North African War. Yet the news arrived long after the desert battles had ended, and for many who had endured those years, it felt both like a victory and an echo. The announcement reached volunteers scattered across bases and training camps in the Middle East and Europe. Some had been moved to regular units. Others were still carrying out support roles that had changed as the war's centre moved northward. But wherever they were stationed, the message stirred a deep and quiet emotion. They had dug trenches at El Alamein, repaired roads under fire, hauled supplies through dust storms, and manned anti-aircraft guns during night raids. They had given the British Army years of steady labour, and now London recognised them not just as helpers, but as a distinct formation, something they had imagined since the first days of the war. When the brigade began to gather, its identity took visible form. For the first time, Jewish soldiers under British command marched with a brigade badge bearing a Star of David, a symbol approved by the British military itself. Trucks and equipment carried the same emblem, marking them as a unit with a name, a presence, and a continuity rooted in years of unrecognised service. For many veterans of the desert, this symbolism mattered as much as any tactical role the brigade might later play. It represented the confirmation of sacrifices made in heat, dust, and danger. The leadership of the new brigade reflected its roots. Many officers and non-commissioned men had been shaped by their experiences in Egypt and Cyrenaica, where distance, hardship, and constant labour had built a resilience now seen as essential for a combat unit. They carried forward not just military training, but the memory of years defined by service without status. The brigade they helped form was therefore not an entirely new creation. It was the result of what had begun when the first volunteers boarded ships in Haifa in 1940. Yet the war had moved on. North Africa was no longer a battlefield, and the brigade's combat role would unfold not in the desert, but in Italy, where it joined the final phase of the Allied campaign. Its actions, there non-graphic, and presented only as brief context within this story, included taking part in the closing operations against retreating German forces and helping with post-liberation humanitarian work. But these events lie outside the heart of the story. The brigade's Italian chapter belonged to another landscape, another rhythm of war. Its origins, identity, and symbolic power remained rooted far earlier in tasks that had never been officially called combat. For many volunteers, the irony was evident. They had fought for recognition during the darkest years of the Desert Campaign, only to receive it after the sands had fallen silent. Some felt pride in finally marching under a Jewish flag within the British Army. Others wondered what their brigade might have become had it been approved when Rommel threatened Egypt. Yet most understood that the brigade's importance went beyond the timing of its battles. It marked a turning point in the wartime story of the Yishuv, and a milestone in the global Jewish struggle for agency amid severe danger. In the final months of the war, the brigade's presence echoed across several fronts. It showed that Jewish soldiers could serve not only as labourers and not only as individuals scattered through auxiliary units, but also as a united formation recognized by one of the world's major military powers. Its very existence became a statement of identity and continuity, shaped by men whose first service to the Allied cause had been working with tools, not weapons. After the war, a small number of veterans became involved in secret efforts to assist survivors of the Holocaust, an episode mentioned only briefly here, in line with the limits of this narrative. But even without delving into that chapter in depth, the larger arc remained clear. The Brigade had been born of years of persistence, political negotiation, and quiet acts of endurance carried out far from the usual front lines of history. In remembering the Jewish Brigade, therefore, the story must return to where it began, not to the hills of Italy, where it finally saw combat, but to the depots of Alexandria, the roads of Cyrenaica, and the trenches carved west of El Alamein. Those places shaped the volunteers long before their flag was raised. Those years changed their status from anonymous laborers to recognized soldiers, and those experiences formed the true foundation of a unit that arrived too late for the desert, yet owed its very existence to the men who had served there. They had hoped to fight in North Africa. Instead, they built, repaired, carried, defended, and proved themselves indispensable. The brigade that ultimately marched under the Star of David was the answer to a question the desert had asked again and again. Had they earned recognition? The final formation, approved in 1944, was Britain's reply, and though it came after the sandstorms had settled, it carried the mark of every mile the volunteers had walked, every trench they had dug, and every moment in which they had stood steady in a war that rarely offered steady ground. Honor the stories that rarely reach the spotlight, stories of service, identity, and resilience shaped far from the front lines. Join me for more interesting chapters of World War II by hitting like, subscribing, and sharing this documentary. And let me know in the comments which hidden histories you want to explore next.